Israeli police said on Friday that Muslim men under the age of 50 would not be allowed at Al-Aqsa mosque compound in an announcement made hours before expected mass protests. Now, let me back up and explain how this all began. Israeli encroachment of Al-Aqsa mosque compound has prompted the international community to call for calm and a restoration of the status quo, which gives Muslims religious control over the compound and Jews the right to visit but not pray there. The site houses Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock Shrine, Islam's third holiest site after Mecca and Medina, as well as the ruins of the biblical Jewish temple. Palestinian worshippers had refused to pray inside Al-Aqsa Mosque since Israel installed new security measures following an attack on July 14th, where it was alleged that 2 Israeli security officers were killed by 3 Palestinians, who were then killed by Israeli police in the compound following the violence. Israel then canceled Friday prayers and shut down the compound for the first time since 1969, prompting outrage among Palestinians. Thousands usually gather at the mosque for Friday prayers. The compound was reopened 2 days later after metal detectors were installed at the entrances and restrictions on entry were enforced, whereby Israeli authorities limited entry to the Old City and Temple Mount to men aged 50 and over and women of all ages. The actions by the Israeli government is viewed by Palestinians and others of the international community as collective punishment and an infringement on the status quo, which, as I mentioned earlier, gives Muslims religious control over the compound and Jews the right to visit but not pray there. Now, in protest, Palestinian worshippers have been conducting prayers outside by the gates, and Israeli security forces have clamped down on daily demonstrations throughout the week, resulting in dozens of injuries. World officials have expressed their concern and called on Israel and Jordan, the custodian of the compound, to reach an agreement in a bid to diffuse the tensions. With us today to help us understand what is happening on the ground is Dan Cohen, a journalist and filmmaker and the director of the forthcoming documentary Killing Gaza. Welcome to Middle East in Focus, Mr. Cohen.
Hey, good to be with you.
So, Mr. Cohen, can you talk first about the overall significance of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound and how control of the compound is divided up?
Well, as you explained, the Al-Aqsa compound is the third holiest site in Islam. It actually predates the pilgrimage sites of Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia. It's where Muslims believe Muhammad ascended to heaven. But, you know, it kind of actually transcends its religious significance. It's the kind of foremost symbol of Palestinian nationalism. Palestinian homes throughout Israel and the occupied territories and the refugee camps where generations of refugees have been languishing since the creation of Israel. There are images of Al-Aqsa that adorn the walls, and so it's really kind of the heart of Palestinian nationalism. And it's, you know, it has significance to Muslims throughout the world. That's significance. The arrangement is since 1967, after Israel began its occupation of East Jerusalem and the West Bank, is that it shares administrative control with the Jordanian religious authority called the Waqf. And the agreement is that that anyone is allowed to visit. However, it's a strictly Islamic worship site, and Jews are allowed to visit but not allowed to pray. And that's actually in accordance with Jewish law, Jewish rabbinical edicts that have existed for several hundred years, that not only is Jewish prayer forbidden, but even Jews stepping foot onto the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound is forbidden and punishable by a divinely imposed death penalty. So in Orthodox Judaism, their reverence for, you know, what is considered the holiest site in Judaism by actually staying away from it.
I see. So for Orthodox Jewish religious beliefs, Jewish communities are actually supposed to stay away from Al-Aqsa as a respect for the holiness of the site?
Exactly. There's a couple of reasons for that. One of them being it's kind of a seemingly esoteric religious reason, but it has to do with ritual impurity dating back to biblical times. where the conditions are not correct for Jews to be ritually pure. In order to be ritually pure, you have to have the ashes of a red heifer, like a red cow, in order to purify yourself from contact with the dead, which makes Jews impure according to Jewish law. And so that there is no red heifer in existence now, and so that is the rules according to Orthodox Judaism. However, religious Zionism has kind of upended that edict, and more religious Zionist rabbis are telling their followers to go to the Al-Aqsa compound as a show of sovereignty. So basically, Zionism, as you know, this national movement is basically rewriting Judaism in order to fit its political agenda.
So let's talk in more detail about how Israeli encroachment on Al-Aqsa Mosque is part of the political Zionist project. Can you elaborate on that? And specifically, what is the Temple movement and its significance to this encroachment of Israeli control on Al-Aqsa Mosque compound?
Sure. So since even early Zionism, the first Zionists to actually covet the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, you know, the Temple Mount, what Jews call it, were I wouldn't call them secular, because there's Zionism is not. I mean, they're, you know, Zionists, even the secular system in Israel, the education system, they're taught that the Bible is true, and it's in order to kind of create and perpetuate the myth of like a return of the Jewish people to, you know, the biblical land of Israel. But it was seen as the first Zionists saw it as like a national idea of having the Knesset at the Al-Aqsa compound and destroying the mosque. And then basically, but it really has its heart in religious Zionism, which is this idea that the way to bring what is considered Jewish redemption, to bring the Messiah, is to settle Palestine, to settle the biblical land of Israel, which, you know, Palestine and beyond. And settling involves ethnic cleansing. So religious Zionism kind of fused Orthodox Judaism and secular, if we can call it that, Zionism, in order to create this very fundamentalist idea. It took kind of the extremism of Orthodox Judaism and the activist spirit of secular Zionism and fused them to create what I would call like an ISIS-like ideology that requires total ethnic cleansing. That's the goal of Palestine, of indigenous peoples, in order to bring the Messiah. For years and years, this was very fringe. I'll fast forward to 1967, when the occupation of the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai, began. It was kind of this awakening for religious Zionists that prophecy is coming into being. You know, that God is making Israel conquer all these lands, and it's all happening, and these are biblical times. And so that, you know, that was when the settlement project began. And it gave birth shortly after, in 1973, after Israel was kind of defeated in the 1973 war. It gave birth to Gush Emunim, which was like the settler group that saw it had to settle the West Bank. And so basically this fundamentalist group, they saw the peace agreements, the peace process, beginning in 79 with the withdrawal from the Sinai desert, from the Egyptian Sinai, as against the word of God. And so in order to reverse that, a settler named Yehuda Etzion, he to bomb the Dome of the Rock in order to derail the peace agreement. So it had purely political, it had political reasons. It was not, you know, in keeping with Orthodox Judaism. This is all kind of mutations of Orthodox Judaism. Well, meanwhile, Orthodox Jews are still maintaining this ban on on going to Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount, and they do to this day, the vast majority of them. It's a very small minority that's interested in going to Al-Aqsa.
Wait, so actually, Dan, just before you move on there, so are there Orthodox Jewish movements right now who are outraged at what the Israeli government is doing on Al-Aqsa?
Without a doubt, the vast majority of Orthodox Jews in Israel totally oppose it, and not for humanitarian reasons, but for one thing, for theological reasons, but also because they correctly understand that it is a provocation to go up there to Palestinians whose land has been colonized. And so when there have been attacks, when Palestinians have attacked after they've been provoked by these Israeli settlers, Orthodox Jews have blamed their religious Zionist counterpart for the bloodshed.
So if you can, I mean, you're talking about the history and what's leading up to this moment. Can you, and you've talked a little bit about it in our conversation thus far, but again, elaborate on this point that you've been quoted as saying, which is the movement to destroy the Al-Aqsa compound is positioned as the tip of the spear in the Zionist project in Israeli society against Palestinians. Elaborate exactly on what you mean and why it is so crucial that that people stand in solidarity with this movement to stop the Israeli authorities from doing what they're doing on Al-Aqsa compound.
Right. So the man I mentioned, Yehuda Etzion, when he went to prison, he came out. He went to prison for a few years. He was released early, and he said instead of militant vigilante attacks to blow up the mosque, we just have to convince Israeli society to do it. So he, with a few other people, started a movement. He basically what became today's Temple movement, and the subsequent peace agreements, the Oslo Accords, and the Gaza withdrawal radicalized religious Zionists so much that this far fringe ideology, what 20, 30 years ago was considered very fringe, has now mainstreamed today into an organized lobby that's well-funded and is in the Knesset. I would say the most prominent figure his name is Yehuda Glick. He is a student of Etzion, and he came into the Knesset on a platform of his entire issue was building the temple, which is synonymous with destroying the mosque. He has major support in the Knesset. After last week's attack, he had an emergency session in the Knesset with none other than Israel Ariel, who I want to quote here. I recorded in a closed meeting I was able to access simply because of my name, Dan Cohen. I was able to access this. But this is Chief Rabbi of the Temple Movement, Yisrael Ariel, who runs the state-funded Temple Institute. And here, I'm going to paraphrase. God is the one who commanded us to go from city to city, conquering them, and to impose the 7 laws of the sons of Noah throughout the world. The sons of Noah meaning humanity. If they raise the flag of surrender and say, from now on, there's no more Christianity and no more Islam, and the mosques and Christian spires come down, and we will follow the 7 laws. If not, you kill all of their males by sword and leave only the women. So this is the ideological core of today's Temple movement, which is responsible for the provocations. And what the Temple movement does is go to the Al-Aqsa compound surrounded by heavily armed Israeli police, walk around its premises, and tell and shout and sing at Palestinians that we will destroy your mosque, hoping that Palestinians will react, that it will serve as a provocation, and then the army, the Israeli army who is there, will have the pretext to expel the Palestinians, and anyone who resists will be killed. And the whole point of that is to launch a huge war in which they can expel all Palestinians and then, advance into neighboring countries as well. Knesset Zevulun Orlev of the Jewish Home Party, who said that the construction, who called for the construction of a temple at the compound, saying that the removal of Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque would mean that, quote, the billion-strong Muslim world would surely launch a world war. So a war activist movement, I would call, frankly, a death cult, because Israelis are dying in this too, not only Palestinians.
So, Mr. Cohen, you're bringing up points that's actually leading to my next question, which is, this is not something that is only significant over there. This is something that is significant to the world. And, world officials have been expressing grave concern over the rising tensions happening at Al-Aqsa compound. Can you talk in more detail about why this is so significant to the world? And then specifically about the calls for Israel and Jordan, the custodians of the compound, to reach an agreement to diffuse the tensions. What kind of agreement, if any, can and should be reached? And do Palestinians have any say with respect to this agreement?
Well, what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine. It has enormous impact on the region. I'm actually currently in Amman, Jordan. We've seen protests here, saying that it's our duty to protect the mosque. Of course, there's most of Jordan, the residents of Jordan are Palestinian themselves, so they have a particular affinity for it. There were protests by Houthis in Yemen who are being, waged war upon by the supposed Islamic, guardian country of Saudi Arabia, which is now in basically an open alliance with Israel, as it wages the worst humanitarian catastrophe in the world in Yemen. Yet it's basically silent about what's happening, Israeli incursions at the Al-Aqsa compound. So it has immense impact around the world. It's kind of hard to overstate that. Your other question?
Was specifically about, the world officials calling on Israel and Jordan, custodians of the compound, to reach an agreement to diffuse tensions. What does it mean, first, that Israel and Jordan are custodians? In other words, what kind of agreement, if any, could they reach to diffuse tensions? And what say, if any, do Palestinians have with respect to that agreement?
Right. Well, I think Palestinians have really asserted themselves as much as they can. It's been mostly... it's been huge demonstrations that have been almost, completely nonviolent, just huge prayer demonstrations. In terms of what Jordan and Israel can agree on, well, it would just be returning to the status quo that's existed, but Israel has continued to unilaterally change the status quo while Netanyahu goes on the world stage and says, I'm observing the status quo, I'm keeping it. It's kind of like how Israel talks about the peace process. We're continuing the peace process. Meanwhile, settlements expand, and Palestinian villages are destroyed. So, while we've seen restrictions on freedom of worship for Palestinians at Al-Aqsa, we've also seen an expansion of Jewish fundamentalists going up there, especially in the past few years, more and more. This year more than ever. So if the Waqf, the Jordanian religious endowment, actually made an offer recently before any of this broke out to Israel to return to the status quo and just to continue to allow these Jewish fundamentalists to go up there as long as they don't incite, as long as they don't say, we're going to destroy your mosque. And so that is essentially, what Israel could do. But I think it's important to stress that this is a calculated political decision by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sacrifice, the so-called security on the altar of his political survival. He is embroiled in controversy right now surrounding the purchase of German submarines, as well as another scandal with a telecommunications company. And so, as this scandal is threatening his continued rule, and other Israeli politicians are really sensing blood in the water, going after him, he went against the advice of the Israeli military and the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Service, like Israel's FBI, who said who advised him to take the metal detectors that they had installed, and remove them, and that would calm things down and avoid the outbreak of a potential intifada, major unrest throughout Israel and the territories. And Netanyahu declined to do it, simply because of his political survival.
This is Middle This is Middle East in Focus, and we are talking with our guest, Dan Cohen, journalist, filmmaker, and director of the forthcoming documentary Killing Gaza, about the Israeli encroachment on Al-Aqsa Mosque, which includes shutting down the mosque for 2 days, which included Friday prayers, and installing metal detectors, causing tensions to rise between Palestinians and Israelis, causing concern amongst the international community, and calls for a restoration of the status quo, which gives Muslims religious control over the compound and Jews the right to visit but not pray there. Mr. Cohen, I want to turn our attention now, still on Palestine, but specifically to Gaza, and we're going to start moving into our last segment for the hour, looking at the situation in Gaza right now, and actually how the crisis with respect to Qatar, and again the role of Saudi Arabia in all of this, in impacting Gaza. But could you, before we get into Qatar specifically in that crisis and how it's affecting Palestinians, could you give us some insight into the situation right now in Gaza in terms of the humanitarian crisis?
I mean, the situation in Gaza is absolutely catastrophic. I've been going to Gaza since 2014, since the last Israeli war on Gaza, and the last time I was able to visit was last October. And each time I would go back, the situation would worsen. There was less electricity, there was less water. Now Gaza is down to about 2 hours of electricity per day, which is completely unlivable. Hospitals are shutting down. Literally, children are dying because they're not able to get medical treatment. The siege has tightened, so they're not able to travel to get this medical treatment. And this is basically Israel and the Palestinian Authority, its occupation subcontractor, collaborating against Gaza in order to overthrow Hamas, so it can install the Palestinian Authority as the ruling party. In order to do that, they're basically willing to sacrifice Palestinian babies. There was a 6-day-old baby that died recently because it was unable to get medical treatment that is unavailable in the Gaza Strip. So it's an absolute crisis, and it's really shameful.
So I want to actually bring into the conversation our next guest, Isra Qatar, and I want to talk more in depth about how the Qatar crisis is affecting Palestinians, and specifically Palestinians within Gaza. Aid groups and residents of the Gaza Strip have expressed concern over Qatar's rift with several Arab countries, specifically Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, and Egypt, which could affect aid to the impoverished region. Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, said on Tuesday that Qatar, quote, has been very important as an investor in Gaza and as a contributor to the infrastructure projects there, end quote. Jan also added that this might now not easily continue because of the Qatar crisis with Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, and Egypt. Qatar is among the biggest contributors of aid to Palestinian territory. Qatari support comes in the form of humanitarian projects to improve the lives of 2 million people of Gaza, which has been under an Israeli-Egyptian blockade. It has built a housing complex for thousands of families, paved major roads across Gaza, built a hospital, and funded the reconstruction of hundreds of houses that were destroyed or damaged during a 50-day war with Israel in 2014. Now, with the crisis looming between Qatar and its Arab neighbors, residents in Gaza expect the worst to come. If this happens, and Qatar does withdraw its support, it will severely affect the people of Gaza, especially because Qatar is a huge financier of reconstruction projects after the war and charity work, as entrepreneur Ahmed Razak has been quoted as saying. He's also said that eventually the people in Gaza will pay the price because of the conflict. So with us to talk more about how the Qatar crisis is affecting Palestinians and Palestinian politics is, as I said, Isra Qatar. She completed her master's degree in public policy from the University of York and Erasmus University. She's also studied international relations at the American University of Sharjah. Her research is driven by her passion for the Palestinian cause and interest in the wider MENA region. She's researched extensively on the topic of Palestinian civic engagement, the boycott movement in Jordan. Currently, she works for an international organization in the humanitarian sector, and she writes analytical articles on regional and world politics, including her recent article on this issue. Welcome to Middle East in Focus, Ms. Qatar.
Hi, thank you.
So first, yeah, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, so thank you so much again for joining us. Can you explain what is the rift between Qatar and, as you call it, the Gulf Triad, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Bahrain, along with Egypt?
Well, basically, I think it's very important to understand that the conflict started way before June 5th. I think a lot of people see it as something that just suddenly happened. But in reality, if you look back, you'll see that the conflict started a long time before that, and there were indications of it even in 2014 when there was a cut in the ties between the different countries of the Gulf region, mostly over fears of the relationships that Qatar has been forming with parties or certain countries or movements that are not necessarily supported by Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. So basically what happened is in 2014 they had this document or this agreement in which Qatar was supposed to abide by certain rules and by certain regulations. But as time has passed, the Gulf has seen that Qatar is not necessarily doing that. Some of these regulations or these agreements revolved around the idea of Qatar not necessarily dealing with certain parties, cutting their ties to the Islamic Brotherhood, not giving citizenship to members of other Gulf countries who have been, punished by these countries by taking away their passports. So basically, there were a couple of things that were required by Qatar, and they didn't abide by them. In 2017, the Gulf region looked back at their agreement, and they saw that Qatar is still supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, which is seen by the Gulf, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as a threat to the sort of Middle East that they envision. And some people even claim that they see it as a threat to their own authority in the region. So I would say that basically more or less sums up the reason why the rift started. I would say it's mainly about the Muslim Brotherhood and the role it plays and the importance it has within Qatari politics.
Okay, so in talking about that specifically, again, the fact that it's related to Qatar's relationship with the Muslim Brotherhood, something that you stated in your piece, and I'll just quote you if you don't mind. It would seem that the current crisis and its impact on Hamas has been viewed as a golden opportunity to reshape Palestinian politics and possibly curb the Hamas link to the Muslim Brotherhood and Qatar. Can you explain in what ways and by whom has the current crisis been viewed as an opportunity to reshape Palestinian politics and curb the Hamas link to the Muslim Brotherhood in Qatar?
Well, I think the crisis itself was seen as an opportunity for almost every stakeholder in the conflict. So whether it's Israel or Saudi or Egypt or even the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank. But I think the people who have made the biggest move or the biggest step towards taking advantage of it were Egypt and the Emirates, who, along with Mohammed Dahlan, who was basically a member of the Palestinian Authority, but who has been more or less distanced from it since 2011, had the chance to return to Palestinian politics by trying to forge some sort of agreement or some sort of relationship with the Hamas leadership in Gaza. So basically, I would say it was mainly Egypt and the UAE who were able to use this to their advantage. And in answer to your question about how they were able to reshape it, there has been a lot of talk about the fact that Gaza is going to be now run by Dahlan and Hamas, not just Hamas on its own, and that it will be far more connected to Egypt. By doing so, they are distancing Hamas from Iran or the Iranian influence, but they're also distancing it from Qatar as well as the Islam or the Muslim Brotherhood. So why has there been some sort of distance in the relationship between Qatar and Hamas? It's there because on one hand, Qatar themselves see themselves in a position where they need to ask for that sort of distance in order to abide by the requirements by the other Gulf countries. And Hamas, on the other hand, has been put in a very difficult position because without Qatar giving them the needs or the financial support that they were getting, they will need to get it from somewhere else. So in turn, they will naturally have to distance themselves from Qatar.
Well, and sort of how will this impact the Palestinians in Gaza? I mean, not just how will this political reshaping impact the Palestinians in Gaza who are already suffering a catastrophic reality?
Well, I think it can be. It depends. Time will tell. I think it depends on what's going to happen next. Is the Hamas leadership going to actually go ahead with this plan to rule with Dahlan, and is Egypt going to be helping by providing them with fuel and by opening the Rafah crossing? If that happens, then things would probably be better for the average Palestinian. On the other hand, it could turn completely differently. Hamas might look towards Iran, which would focus more on their military capacity as opposed to helping with the rebuilding of Gaza, which is what Qatar was doing, or what it was focusing on. So it could pretty much happen, and there could be a lot of different scenarios. But the reality on the ground right now is that things are getting much worse, and that is due to the pressure put on Hamas by different parties, including the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank.
This is Middle East in Focus, and we are talking about the impact the rift between Qatar and several Arab countries is and could further have on Palestinians. With our guest, Isra Qatar, a human rights activist and writer and scholar whose recent article you can check out online, Open Democracy, entitled Gaza in Transit, What After the GCC Crisis. And we are also joined by Dan Cohen, independent journalist and filmmaker. Dan, I actually want to bring you back into the conversation and get your thoughts on how the Qatar crisis could impact Palestinians even further and making the humanitarian crisis even worse, which feels and like that's unimaginable, but that absolutely is what we are potentially going to be facing.
Well, I think the other element that that Saudi Arabia and kind of the remaining GCC allies are talking about, what they're pushing Qatar against is its connections with Iran. Qatar hasn't been completely on board with basically isolating Iran with the eventual goal of destabilizing it that Saudi Arabia has. Is kind of subject to the political machinations of the region, so it could get significantly worse. But Hamas has actually continued to maintain some relations with Iran. So depending on what happens, I mean, it could kind of go either way. But the situation is catastrophic, and it simply for humanitarian reasons, it has to get better. But it's just hard to predict.
And Mr. Cohen, can you, just in our last few minutes here, discuss the U.S. position on the situation with respect to Al-Aqsa compound, as well as the situation with respect to Gaza, and what, if any, people here in the United States can do to stand in solidarity with Palestinians and Israelis who are working for justice, peace, and human rights in the region?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, the U.S. position has been, under the Trump administration, has largely been the same as it has under the Obama administration and the Bush administration before that, and all the administrations going back for many years, which has been to cede all of its leverage to Israel as it becomes increasingly right-wing, government after government. And so the U.S. government, sadly, is not going to be a source of salvation for any Palestinians, as it's going to continue to provide weapons for the Israeli military, which, constantly threatens another catastrophic war against residents. And so I think it's really important for American citizens to get out in the streets and protest and write your congressman and show some solidarity with Palestinians who are living in these catastrophic conditions.
This is Middle East in Focus, and we have been talking about the impact of the rift between Qatar and several Arab countries, the impact that's been having and could further have on Palestinians. With our guest, Isra Qatar. She's a writer, scholar, and human rights activist whose recent article you can check out online at Open Democracy, and it's entitled Gaza in Transit, What After the GCC Crisis. Thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Qatar.
Thank you for having me.
We've also been joined by Dan Cohen. He's an independent journalist and filmmaker, as well as director of the forthcoming documentary Killing Gaza. Thank you so much, Mr. Cohen, for joining us today.
Thank you. There's actually one more point I would like to make, if possible.
Yes, please.
The other thing about what's happening in the U.S. Is we see this anti-BDS legislation, which is there's a bill to make it punishable by make it a felony, punishable by up to 20 years in prison. And so we see that actually criticizing Israel is becoming forbidden in the U.S. and Israel is kind of, I would call it, the greatest threat to free speech in the U.S. So when we say what happens in Palestine doesn't stay in Palestine, it's also that this is coming back. This is, maybe we could call it blowback on American citizens, on our democratic freedoms. And it's unfortunate that it's not Russia that's carrying it out, or else that's not pushing this, or else maybe the democratic establishment would be concerned with this meddling. But it's our ally Israel, and it's out in the open. There's no conspiracy. So it's not just a matter of Palestinian suffering. It's also for our own well-being in the U.S. And I think it's more important than ever to fight against it.
Thank you very much for bringing that point up, and that is something we'll talk about in our next show. But about the fact